Hey there, Adam.
Hey, Jonathan.
How are you?
Good. Your camera's not.
Yeah, it is telling me that you can't start your video because the host has stopped that thing again.
Oh, that's right. I gotta make you a host.
Ah, there we go.
Okay. 1 second. Now we'll thank you. Okay. All right. You should have slide control now as well.
Pardon, say that one more time.
You should have slide control as well.
I sure do. That is perfect. Thank you. And I can still plan to monitor the chat if that works well for you.
Yeah, and if you can just see like who, like, because I can't, if I pull back and into the word, if I pull back to where I can see the attendees in the chat, then it'll move the slide.
Totally fine. I will man the chat then.
Yeah, see if anybody comes in.
That's great.
So just welcome anybody in, and then if they come in. My guess is we have 10 registrants. There's more people. There's lots of people entered. I don't know if we'll see how many of them show up, and then not that we'll just have a good conversation.
Awesome.
Still, and then they'll get the replay.
I will let you know, it sounds like your headphones, like maybe it's something on my end, but you're coming in like every other word.
You were coming in choppy
I
on
am as
my side
well.
of things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Hold on.
Let me look at.
Let me make sure that no one else is on my Wi-Fi.
And not that I don't think that it could be me. Uh, I've been using these multiple times this week, so it's
Okay.
just super weird.
Well, and you were
It's
wearing them.
also it's all sharing with my phone. Hello, is that any better?
Keep talking.
Is this any better?
Yeah, that's better. That's better.
Okay, you can hear me better.
I can hear you better. Yes,
Okay, you're a little now, which is weird.
I am. Okay. I might need to get on my hotspot then. I love Wi-Fi issues. Give me one sec.
It's ridiculous because seriously do this every single day. You know, host connecting them is going to be really annoying.
Okay. Is this any better? No. Ugh.
I'm going to do a little test here. Actually, I'm just going to turn Bluetooth off on my phone for a second.
Okay. I'm back, I think, now. Is this any better?
Yeah, your video is delayed just a little bit, but
Okay.
I'm going to test mine real quick.
I can hear you just fine now.
You're better. I think that's better. I think that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, looks like it's okay. All right, let me share it again. All right, there you go.
Awesome. Great.
Yeah, all set up. 2
Oh,
minutes.
how's your Friday morning been?
It's been all right. It's been a little hectic. Finished the worksheet this morning. Got it on the internet, and I had previously scheduled a cut. Like it's just my regular cut time, which I forgot about. But it's like I want to miss it.
Nice.
So ran and got my haircut. I need to find somebody that doesn't want to talk to me all the time. This is not my. This is like my thing. I want to find someone that can cut my hair well,
Yep.
that just will leave me alone and go to sleep while
Yeah.
she fixes my hair
Yes.
and wake up and go home. But
I make the mistake every time. I don't go see the same person, but I go to the same salon or whatever. And I make the mistake every time of saying, oh, like I'm a therapist. And then they will just share everything with me. And I'm like, I just need my haircut right now. So I feel your pain.
hey, I'd do it again. I'm right without my headphones real quick to see
Okay.
if
Okay.
you're choppy on your end, to see if it's headphones.
Okay.
All right.
Oh, you sound so much better now.
You do. Correct. And everybody's seeing my reminder to take vitamins. Welcome everybody that's coming in. I appreciate you being here. I got a little preview as we were starting there. As usual, we have just technology just provides us curveballs every single time, right? Didn't happen at all yesterday in practice at all. But we're glad you're here. If you don't know me, my name is Dr. Adam Mathews. I am the Executive Director of Mathews Counseling here in Cary, North Carolina. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. Been in private practice for about 8 years, been doing therapy for 18 years, which makes me feel extremely old. And then with us is one of our therapists, Jonathan Bell. Jonathan, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan. I am a therapist on staff at Mathews Counseling. I am a licensed clinical social work associate and also a licensed clinical addiction specialist associate. And I have been working with Mathews Counseling for a year and some change. Yeah, I think about a year and 4 months or so. So yeah, loving being here. And I live in Durham, and like Adam said, our practice is in Cary. So just commute back and forth.
Well, then it's telehealth. We're all over the state as well. So
right.
And we're excited about kind of what we're talking about today. It is, as Mariah Carey officially announced on Tuesday, right? It's a holiday season. And that brings with it a lot of stress and a lot of angst, or particularly for LGBTQ individuals. And so we want to talk about that, and we want to kind of dive into that. And hopefully the idea is to give a roadmap today of how to manage those family relationships that can be so stressful. And a couple things just I want to mention to you as well as we get started is that we're going to give you a free PDF at the end of the webinar that will help you kind of get more specific with your needs and your family situation, because we know everybody is different. And we're going to give you that link to download that. We're also going to give you, if you attended the webinar, we're going to send you a code to get your first therapy session free with us as well at the end. So we're going to talk about that. So be sure to hang on for those things. There's also, we're going to be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions as we go, feel free to put them in there. We want to make sure that it's applicable to you. So feel free to light up that chat with some questions, and we'll be sure to be taking breaks and some time, and we'll reserve some time at the end for those questions as well. So we want to just kind of start off just talking about this idea, right, that the holidays are stressful. It's not a new idea. It is not a bold idea. It is just a fact that sometimes we talk about them as being the happiest time of the year, but 38% of the US population, just in general, just everybody, 38% report that they see extreme jumps in their stress level during the holiday season. And I just tell you, just acknowledging that it's November, I can feel, Jonathan, I don't know about you, but I can feel my stress levels already rising of going, okay, I got to buy all the gifts. We make all the plans. I've got to cook all the food. And so the stress level just automatically rises and goes up. But for LGBTQ IA plus individuals, the holidays aren't just stressful, right? They can be harmful, and they can even be traumatic when you talk about dealing with unsupportive, unaffirming family members. And there's lots of different ways that can happen. And so we just want to kind of acknowledge that off the bat. And when we talk about the LGBTQ experience, right, there's some things that just in general that we want to make sure we acknowledge, because it's the stress. It's not, when we talk about stress, it's not just everyday stress. It's stress that leads to mental and emotional deficits, right? So for most of these stats are pretty well known as well, but 3.5 times more likely than non-LGBTQ individuals to experience mental illness, 2.5 more times to likely to experience depression, anxiety, substance abuse, higher rates of drug and alcohol disorder. We know the sad stats around
suicide, particularly with our youth as well, that LGBTQIA plus youth are 5 times more likely to attempt suicide. 50% of trans youth seriously considered suicide, and 40% of trans adults have attempted suicide at some point in their life, right? So all of that tells us that the stress that the general population feels is going to be felt even more by LGBTQIA plus folks. And when you enter into the holiday times and the thought of seeing and being around family, even if you've been able to kind of move away and differentiate from family a little bit, right? That stress just goes up, right? It increases the likelihood of all sorts of things. So we're going to talk a little bit about, real briefly, about why that is and what those experiences are like and what we normally do with them. And then at the end, we're going to try to give you some, spend the majority of our time on some strategies that actually work, right? And that are practical tools. We can talk about the idea that we want to take care of ourselves all day, but we really have to talk about some really practical tools and strategies. But first, just this idea, why are the holidays so challenging beyond our just normal holiday stress and events, right? There is this idea, and you've experienced it if you're an adult that has gone back to your family of origin and spend much time around them. It's this idea of family regression, right? And what happens is that when we go back to our families, we fall back into the family system. We fall back into the roles that we played in childhood. And we fall back into these things that maybe we have grown out of, so to speak, right? So Jonathan, I don't know about you. I was the oldest kid, right? So my role was as the perfectionist and the one that takes care of everybody and makes sure so when I go back home, right, I'm planning the events with my siblings and telling them when to be and what to do. And my sisters in particular, right, get super frustrated with me about that, and that kind of blows up as well. Do you feel like that happens for you? Do you feel like that happens?
I fit the role as the family performer, so which I sort of elected myself into that role at times, and at times it is fun, and at times it is exhausting. So I'm the one that tries to keep things fun, light, and easy. I am the one that perhaps is speaking too much at the dinner table or trying to force conversation that shouldn't be forced, and typically sharing too much of what's going on with myself personally. So I typically fall back into that trap.
Well, and I imagine that is not always the case. Like there's some roles that that's just our personality, right? But there's sometimes where like the function in the family is to be the performer, as you're saying, or the scapegoat, or the clown that's keeping everybody entertained, right? Or there's the truth teller, right? There's all kinds of different roles that you have in your family. And when you go back and you're around your family of origin, it can be hard to escape those, particularly if they no longer serve you as an adult. And what then happens too is that the triggers that we experience from our childhood, right? Those things that really that can set off anxiety for us, that can set off stress, that can set off our any other challenges for us, they're more sensitive, right, in childhood. And so those are the things that we revert back to, and it makes it a challenge because we may have matured past that, we may have differentiated, we may not have, but as we grow, typically when we move away from our families, we've established our own adult identity, but when we go back, it can be really hard to break out of those roles and to bring our full self there.
And I think it's just interesting too. I like that you bring in the roles too, because it's so just a part of the family norm. It's perhaps parents or siblings are not even aware that they are putting the person back into that role of like, oh gosh, like there goes Adam again, like trying to, he'll be the one to tell us when to go where and everything. And you perhaps feeling, I that's no longer my role. That's no longer the personality that I adhere to. And now my family's making me do it again. And sometimes family isn't even aware that they are doing it. It's just so ingrained into that system.
Yeah. And that, like, one of the things that happens with my family a lot is we are loud. My family fights as a way of showing love sometimes, right? There's lots of people that do that, right? And they're loud fights, right? So and that when I go back, like I find myself back in there, and it's stressful because to be able to be pulled back into that, right, when that's not that's very much different from who I am anymore, can be really stressful. Y'all, I'm going to go back and forth with which way these slides are because I cannot figure out the controls. My best here. But Dr. Logan Jones says this, which I think really kind of encapsulates this. It says, when one's psyche is contaminated by the shadow of prejudice and internalized homophobia, right? Bringing it back to like the LGBTQ experience of growing up, more than likely, even these days, in prejudice and internalized homophobia, it can result in depression, anxiety, psychological distress, and other problems of self-esteem. And oftentimes these issues manifest at an early age and are carried into adulthood. And these distressing feelings and the flashbulb memories that are formed in childhood are often unconsciously triggered when returning home from for the holidays. So that I love this concept of flashbulb memories, right? It's like, we may not all go back there completely, but it's like, oh, we're reminded of this. This is how our family works. This is how I have to act around our family. And all of that shame, depression, anxiety, and distress can come right back, and it can feel so alive within our family, and within our family system, right? Right. And so like I just had this idea of like going home for the holidays, right? That stigma, rejection, and judgment can come right along with it, right? And that's where we end up. And what comes with that is like thinking through all the things that can come along with that: anxiety, depression, rejection, a heightened sense of otherness, right? A lot of times, even in families that quote unquote tolerate our queerness, right? We come back home into those families, and there's just this sense of separation. There's this sense of otherness. Yeah. Overt homophobia, but also passive homophobia as well, or just like the idea of silence in general, of not talking about it. We don't talk about the queer parts of you. We don't talk about your friends, your significant others. We don't talk about that side. And so that passive homophobia can be really carry that stigma, rejection, and judgment. Even just like the loneliness factor, I think that's part of that otherness as well, of coming in, you're with people, but you're alone. All of these, that there's others, I'm sure, that are not mentioned on this list, but that idea that these are the things that we deal with, these are the things that we battle when we come back home to our families that are not fully supportive and fully affirming, right?
Yeah.
There's this other concept that I want to talk about this too, like the idea of holiday movies and just the way that not just movies, but media, television shows, Hallmark Channel, right? All the ways that we grew up about what the holidays were supposed to represent, and what this picture, right? It creates this picture in our mind of what the ideal holiday situation would be, even when there's conflict, right? Even when there's conflict, and when we're watching a Hallmark movie, it's always resolved by the end. The couple's always together. The family's always happy. The family's always with each other. And that sense of, even maybe in childhood, that's the ideal that our families strived for, can create this kind of sense, this ideal of what the holiday is supposed to represent, what it's supposed to be for us. And I believe that can be really challenging, in part because I think that creates this grief, right, over losing the family that we should have had, our ideal holiday situation, right? When we feel that, right, a lot of LGBTQ folks anyway have to deal with the grief of loss of their family, what their family is, the relationship they had, who their family members were supposed to be in their lives. But that loss feels more real, I think, sometimes at the holiday, because of that ideal holiday situation, the image that we have in our minds of what the holiday is supposed to be. And so during the holidays, we're grieving that all over again. And oftentimes I do think that grief of the ideal of what we want or what we hoped for, is often more difficult than physical loss, right? Do you feel that at all, Jonathan? Does that resonate with you?
Oh, completely. I sort of had this question sort of in the back of my mind, because as you're walking through, like, how do holiday films lie to us. The only film that I think gets kind of close at it is, and my partner is going to be happy that I'm, shouting this movie out, is The Family Stone. Have you seen it?
Yeah, it is one of Josh's favorite movies of all time.
Okay, and I think there still are elements of the fact that there's so much pressure on this to be like the one time that family comes together, and everything has to be perfect. And I think I'm just wondering, for you, do you see a holiday film that gets at it in any way sort of rightly or correctly? I'm totally fine if
I don't know. I don't. I would have to think about it a little bit. I think the ones like The Family Stone where it's just messy, right? And there's no like full resolution at the end. I think that's the challenging part of those types of movies is that resolution at the end where everything's okay.
Right.
Because I think so many of us leave our holiday family gatherings with relief, right? That it's over, right?
Yeah.
And that I think that's the hardest part to me is like how do you it doesn't make for a cute story sometimes or a cute movie of like it's just over and we've survived it,
right?
But I do think there's in that film that you're mentioning there is this idea of like conflict being okay, right? And it being okay and it moving forward a little bit, right?
That really negative lie of there's going to be a promise that everything will come to be okay in the end, and it just is not, and I think that's where we get so that it can lead to a lot of really intense depression for people when they expect this resolution that most likely is not going to come to pass. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But
I think that's part of that grief of like, because I think it's also the end of the year type of feeling as well of wanting everything wrapped up. And I just don't think the holidays are the time to resolve family conflict, like to resolve that conflict, right? Like try to like make those relationships better during that time. Maybe afterward you come back and you have more conversation that helps kind of move you closer together. But I think for so many people, if we're going in trying to reach that ideal or trying to reach that resolution, it can be really challenging.
Yeah.
There's also this idea that I think is placed on LGBTQ folks about being their responsibility to make things okay. So they have to conform, they have to move, we have to kind of pretend or not rock the boat, so to speak. That can be really challenging. That can be really challenging as well, because that's a lot of pressure, right? That we're the ones that have to initiate. It's sometimes that resolution, right? Sometimes just making the holidays stress-free for everybody else, right? Because especially if you come from an unaccepting and unsupportive family, right? Then the idea is don't come in and disturb our holiday bliss, so to speak, right? And that responsibility that carries a lot of weight, a lot of pressure, a lot of stress. It's not fair. Right. It's not a completely fair thing. And whether that expectation is real or not, there is that felt reality of the responsibility is on me to make everybody else feel okay. And then there's this idea of just anticipatory, not grief, but just this anticipation, right? The buildup of what is going to happen. Is somebody going to say something? Is somebody going to be cruel? Are they going to put me in a position where I have to be less than myself? Like all this anticipatory, what is going to happen? I think we were talking about it in the beginning of already feeling it as soon as like November hits, as soon as Halloween's over. It's like, the holidays are coming. I'm going to have to see my family. What is it going to be like this time? Right. Which creates its own stress in and of itself, because then every day leading up to it is kind of, it's in the back of my head, and it's leading up to that. So those are just, I think, some reasons of what we're dealing with, what we're talking about. And I'm sure there's more. There may be more that are specific to you guys that are that we haven't mentioned, but I think there's all of those things. Kind of, you can see why for LGBTQ folks, like the holidays represent and present a lot of unique challenges that are really that are there. Like even as we're talking about it, you, Jonathan, I'm feeling this knot like right in the back of my shoulders. Like even just thinking about it, I'm thinking, you know, about my own situations, my situations with clients. Like it's just like all of that. There's just that stress and that tension that I'm just I can even feel it.
I
Right.
feel it. I have a rock sitting in the bottom of my stomach right now, so I'm feeling it as well.
Well, so let's get to some approaches, but there's the typical approach that sometimes the approaches that we're talking about are probably not the best, right? They're understandable, but there's stuff that can sometimes create more stress and anxiety,
Yeah.
And challenges. So why don't you walk us through some of those?
Yeah. So, like Adam said, I'm just going to sort of say, and I don't want any of this to sound like I'm blaming or saying, like, oh, how could you have this approach? All of these approaches make sense. And I don't want anyone that has used these approaches to walk away, you know, slapping themselves on the head, being like, why on earth am I doing this? Typically, these approaches are built out of protective factors or out of your own trauma responses. So, making some space for that. But I'm going to speak to what I typically hear my clients doing to avoid and manage their stress during the holidays. So the first thing, and you know, it's pretty straightforward that people are going to physically or emotionally just cut themselves off. And I want to make a pretty clear delineation that cutting yourself off is different from boundaries. Right. Cutting off is avoidance. It's, I'm not going to handle what is going on here. I'm just going to completely put myself aside from it. So this could look like a number of different ways. It could look like perhaps lying to your family and saying, I'm sick this year, not coming for the holidays. Now that we've had COVID, there's a really easy response of like, oh, just got diagnosed with COVID, won't be around for the holidays. Again, makes perfect sense. If you're thinking, gosh, I don't want to deal with family stress, I'm just going to find some excuse to not be there. So I'm just going to remove myself entirely instead of entering into that space with a boundary put in place. I see also some people just actually showing up, but they're numbing themselves, whether it's through substances, whether it's just by not participating in conversations. Maybe it's like, oh, I'm just going to show up, but I'm going to sit in my room the whole time, and I'm just going to be completely emotionally not a part of the family unit. Again, makes perfect sense, but it still does not allow for the engagement and healthy management of the stress and the family dynamic.
Yeah, because that's emotional cutoff, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
If you show up, numbing through substances means you're emotionally disconnected.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. And I found this term that I found so perfect. It's like shrinking. It's like, I'm going to make myself as small as possible to avoid any type of conflict, right? I'm going to essentially become less of a family unit by not speaking up at the dinner table, not mentioning what's going on in my personal life. I'm going to essentially become as small as possible so my family doesn't even notice me. And the result of that is that you become so much less a part of that family system. Your own identity, your own presence doesn't really matter. Is conflict else?
Yeah.
Right. And like, is the conflict avoided? Yes, maybe. But also you become less a part of that unit, which can lead to more difficult circumstances down the road. If people are used to you taking up a small space, well, they're going to give you that small space each year when the holidays come around. Right. And oftentimes I hear from clients that their typical, their knee-jerk reaction to physically or emotionally cut off is born out of the cognitive distortion of catastrophizing what is going to happen at the holidays. They're starting to think, oh my gosh, like doomsday is just around the corner. I'm just going to, assume that the worst is going to happen. And I am just going to either not show up or I'm going to go and I'm going to have, a flask of booze constantly on me, and I'm just going to get through it just to avoid the worst case scenario, which again makes perfect sense why people do that. Another typical approach that I hear my clients using is just the sacrifice of self, which is similar to what I was saying about shrinking, but a little bit, just wanting to expand on that a little bit more. And that essentially plays out of you just end up tolerating all of perhaps your family's problematic comments or statements, and you don't feel that you can advocate for yourself, that yourself does not matter. Essentially, you then perhaps maybe it's not tolerating problematic comments. Maybe it's you actually literally sacrifice part of yourself, and you are constantly the person that's buying gifts that you can't afford to essentially earn the approval of family. Maybe you're the one that's like, I need to make sure that I'm constantly cooking and cleaning and being this little queer Cinderella in sort of the kitchen, making sure that I essentially earn my place at the table, which again makes perfect sense. But I think what happens a lot of times for people is that this bitterness starts to grow up inside of them of like, gosh, I'm doing all this stuff for my family. I am being pushed to the limit. And, you know, typically it's self-inflicted. It's, okay, I need to just do everything and be less of myself so that I am accepted. And no one's expecting that from you, but the more and more you do it, people will expect that from you. And another perfect example of sacrificing self is not feeling that you can dress in a way that honors your gender expression or gender identity, or not bringing your partner, or not even feeling that you can ask to bring your partner, that you just assume, gosh, okay, family's just not going to respond well to this. There's no way that I can ask to do this. And again, perhaps you have some very clear evidence that proves that family is not going to tolerate your, your choice of dress, or perhaps you bringing your partner. But oftentimes there's just this assumption, even if you don't have evidence, that you're not going to be welcome to bring your partner or the like. And so you just assume, okay, well, my desires don't matter. I'm just going to sacrifice myself and just grin and bear it.
Well, and that sacrifice stuff, I just want to be clear too, like it has an effect on us, right? Over and over time, the more we do that, right, it wears on us. It's like it becomes very much that feeds depression, I think, a lot of times too. It feeds anxiety, it feeds all kinds of things where we're just kind of constantly doing this and shrinking and sacrificing of ourselves, and eventually that's unsustainable.
Correct. And I think too, to add to that depression, I think it's like a people-pleasing tactic, right? It's something to essentially just thwart any conflict. But again, what comes out is, gosh, I don't matter. So I'm gonna start having these depressive thoughts start creeping into my mind. And then also bitterness and resentment towards family, which is really, really distressing to sit with. And perhaps one of the, I hear this sometimes from clients, that they feel that their self-care doesn't matter, that the boundaries that perhaps that they want to set up, that there's no room for that. I don't want to have any more anger or frustration from my family if I say, hey, I want to go to a coffee shop, or I really need to go over to a friend's house. I just need to get away. It's this fear of, gosh, my family is going to respond, well, Jonathan's the one that left the family while we were all, having a happy Christmas or whatever. And so it's this, okay, well, I can't even give myself permission to set up the boundaries that I know that I need. And one of the last, approaches that I think people see, and this is something you said earlier, Adam, is just attempting to sort of change your family's beliefs around an already stressful time of the year. So we have this, I can think of one client in particular, this wasn't around the holidays, but a non-affirming parent was coming to visit, and they had this goal of, by the end of the week after their mom visited, they were like, I really hope I can convince her to be affirming and accepting of me. And I cautioned them, I said, okay, well, like, at the end of the day, you can't control how your parent feels. And what's going to happen if she leaves and she still does not accept you for who you are? And, fortunately, my client was able to say, okay, maybe that's not the best approach. But, and I'm also I want to make it clear that it's not necessarily a bad thing to be your own advocate and to perhaps provide educational resources to your parents to maybe help change their beliefs. But I think especially around the holidays, that's where a lot of conflict and a lot of unnecessary tension can arise. It's a high potential source when you are perhaps trying to bring up topics that people are not comfortable talking about. It's not going to be respected or responded to in the most healthy way that you're wanting it to. And last point, holidays are stressful enough for everyone. And when you're trying to engage in this type of a discussion or this type of sort of a think space with your family, when already people are in the heightened state, it's perhaps just not the best place to do it. I think of one of my favorite Christmas movies is National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. And I think of the mom, she's in the kitchen cooking with her daughter, and her daughter is complaining that all of the relatives from out of town are sleeping in their beds and she has to sleep with her brother. And she's like, Mom, like, why can't they stay in a hotel? And the mom says, I don't know what to tell you. It's Christmas and we're all miserable. And then she pulls out a cigarette, starts smoking a cigarette, and she hears her mother from the den say, are you smoking? And then she slams the knife down on the cabbage.
Yeah.
And there's this just real reality that people are in a heightened state of stress and entering into this sort of cognitive, like belief changing space is most likely not going to yield the results that you're wanting. And you're just going to leave the whole situation feeling a lot of guilt and shame that you didn't reach the goals that you were trying to set out to achieve. And I really like this quote by D. Gregory Smith. He's an Episcopal priest and also a licensed therapist. He says, no matter what the situation, my greatest stressor is worrying about something I have little or no control over. Recognizing that is key. People are going to think what they think, and my thoughts or actions will probably not change that in the short amount of time I have to spend with them during the holiday season. Whether they approve of me or not, excuse me, it's none of my business. My business is to be happy, honest, kind, and healthy, and I can do it. I saw that quote and I was like, oh, that hit me like a ton of bricks. So those are the typical approaches. Adam, is there anything that you have also seen from clients or that you've experienced from people in your life that perhaps I didn't mention?
I mean, I'm sure there's more. I think I don't have any off the top of my head, but I think that the idea, behind how we typically respond when we're talking about what's the typical approach, it's like we want to do something better, right? It's like whatever approach that we take when we fall back into those family roles, when we kind of do those shrinking techniques, the sacrificing of self, the trying to change beliefs, like anything that falls into that category where we go, that didn't work, right? I didn't want that to be that way. And I think that's what we're trying to talk about is like how to do that. But I think this slide is super important because we know that for some people, right, it's not safe enough to go home. And sometimes that decision point is hard, right? Because we care about our families a lot of times. We want to extend ourselves, but sometimes it's just not safe enough. And so we wanted to give some questions that you can consider to go, if I'm answering yes to these questions, all these questions, I might really need to, or even the majority of these questions, I really need to consider whether it's okay for me to be able to go home, right?
Sure, for sure. So this is just 5 really quick but heavy questions to consider. The first one is there a strong threat to your physical, emotional, or mental safety from visiting or spending time with your family? To assess this question, think back on perhaps when you came out to your family, how did they respond? Was there physical, emotional, or mental abuse that took place? Whenever you have brought up your queerness or brought up your partner, how do they respond? Is there some element of your safety that has been threatened by family? If the answer to this question is yes, I mean, that's a pretty clear sign that going home may not be the safest option for you. Second question, is there a repeated pattern of homophobic, transphobic behavior from family? So are they continuing to make comments at the dinner table about using slurs, using language that is just highly problematic and really just hurtful for you? Are they loudly, preaching of, how they are voting and why they're voting for it because they, want to continue to discriminate against queer folks? That's really things that you take an inventory of what conversations around queer issues, what does that look like with your family? Next one, does your family, do they specifically prohibit you from discussing or mentioning your queerness or queer partners? And I want to tease apart this question a little bit because I think the word prohibit is really important here because we can hold space for the fact that family doesn't always know how to talk about queerness. And so just the fact that they don't mention your queerness or your queer partner, they might still be in the place of trying to figure out how to have those conversations. But if they have explicitly prohibited you from talking about your queerness, then that's a different ballgame right there.
It's good.
So is there, we talked a little bit about boundaries so far, but is there a fear that even if you clearly communicate boundaries, that your family is going to retaliate against you and threaten your safety and well-being? It's pretty straightforward there. And last question to think about, this one's sort of double-sided. Have you clearly articulated boundaries? Have your clearly articulated boundaries been repeatedly violated in the past? And if so, have past violations of your boundaries been acknowledged and repaired? So we can recognize sometimes that people aren't always the most, don't have the best memory when it relates to the boundaries you want to set. And family, and not just family, everyone crosses boundaries all the time. But when you articulate, hey, you really crossed that boundary, we had this agreement and you did not stick up to it, and you forced me to do something that I was not comfortable with, how is that met with family? Do they make excuses? Do they say, well, this isn't about you. This is about me. This is about the family. This is about whatever. Or have they said, gosh, I'm so sorry. I did not mean to do that. How can I do better next time? Things to think about here. Adam, did you want to add anything to these, or just any thoughts?
Well, I think in general, it's like we just making sure we acknowledge that there are circumstances that are it's challenging. We wanted to provide these questions a lot because it is a challenging decision to make. Oftentimes, obviously, if your physical safety is threatened, that to me is an automatic no.
Right.
But when you think through how your emotional and mental safety, a lot of times those things are hard to determine because it's hard for ourselves to determine. Other people may be able to look at it. And so one of the things I would add is if it's hard for you to answer these questions, talk to somebody who maybe a trusted person who knows your story, knows your history, knows what's happening in your family. Because I think that's helpful for us to sometimes get an outside opinion about what's happening as well from somebody we can trust, right? So we want to give you a roadmap, some things that we want to just spend a few minutes. And like we said, we're gonna give you a free workbook that kind of takes you through these steps and helps you make the determination of what it looks like for you. But here are just a few things just to consider and some strategies that might be helpful. One of them is, and I know it may be weird to start here, but the first thing that I think we always have to start with is our own self-awareness, right? And so the question we have to say is, what happens to you? And I would encourage you to think about this, not on one hand, we can always answer this, well, this person did this, right? Or this family member said this, or my aunt is super homophobic and says all kinds of slurs all the time, right? But what we also need to understand is how that affects us. What happens internally with us? What part of us is hurt? What are the thoughts that come up about myself and about others? What does my body do, right? Every hurt and emotional response, like we carry that within our bodies. And so we can feel it. And we know, like, maybe my heart rate spikes. Maybe my hands start to get clammy. Maybe my face gets hot and I can feel the tears right there, right? Like, what does my body do? Because that helps me understand what's the emotional response that I'm having and how I react out of that emotional response, right? Those typical behaviors that we talked about, those typical approaches to solving it, a lot of times come out of these really hard emotional spaces that we may or may not be aware of. This process, the process of something happens, something triggers us, something happens, and we have these thoughts that come up about ourselves and others. We make meaning out of it. Our body reacts, the emotion comes up, and then we react. All of that happens like super fast, right? And so being able to slow that process down, right? Because when we understand the thoughts and emotions and the hurt, like what is actually harmful and hurtful, right? A lot of times it comes down, I was with a client the other day where we were getting down to this, he kept saying, I'm hurt. And I was trying to help say, okay, what is hurt, right? And what we got to was this idea that it felt like his family was rejecting him, right? And so like there was this rejection piece going of, I'm rejected, right? And I'm always going to be alone. Like that's the piece that was hurt. Right? And so that he was never going to be good enough was the hurt, right? He was never going to be good enough. They were going to continually reject him. And so that piece of it is this idea of like, then we can start to work with that and say, okay, how do we begin to come up with strategies that are helpful for that? But understanding what is happening with you, I think is super important, because then when we understand what's happening with us, then we can understand what we want, right? And the way that I talk about it is in that kind of first little point there that I think is helpful is beginning with the end in mind, right? And we talked a lot of times about how we leave those holiday situations and we're so relieved that it's over, right? We're so relieved that we just got through it and managed through it. And there was this big explosion that happened, but we were able to survive it. And so a lot of times when we talk about how we're going to handle the holidays, it's a lot about beginning with what do we want to have? What is that feeling we want to have when we walk out of our family's home, right? And we come back and it's January 2nd and we're back at work. Like, what is the thing that we want to have happen? If they were successful, what would have happened? What would the interactions have looked like? What do I want out of my time with my family, right? I have to determine what those relationships I want to look like. And what do I want that is within my ability to control, right? Talking to your point about, I can't change their beliefs, but there are parts of it that I can control. And so when I look at what I want, I may want that perfect family holiday movie ending. But if that's not that's dependent on all these other people that are involved. But there is going to be a part of it that I can control. And so saying like, this is what I want. This is the part of that I can control, which is, spoiler alert, is usually only myself. These are the things that I can do to try to be able to get there, which I think can start to be helpful there.
That's good.
And then good old boundaries, right? We've already mentioned them. Everybody knows them. We all know that boundaries are important, but they are so hard to draw, right? And so there's just a couple things that I would mention here. One is we have to give ourselves permission to set boundaries, right? You are worth taking care of yourself, right? You get to do that. And so giving yourself permission over and over again to say, it is okay that I set boundaries. It is okay that I draw things that take care of myself. That being okay has to come first. That permission, I have to give myself permission to do that first, so that I can begin to say, okay, there are all these events that are happening, right? There's all these ways that that family members are reacting to me that are not okay with me, right? And how do I begin to draw those? And one of those steps is to start to reframe obligations as choices, right? So much of the holidays, I think, and especially family time around the holidays, feels mandatory, right? It feels like we're obligated to be there. And a lot of times that obligation can be a choice. And so we have to be able to begin to see those as, I am making choices about what I participate in. And when I start to do that, then I can say, okay, I'm going to choose this thing is okay, this thing is not okay, right? It may be like the church service that your family wants everybody to go to on Christmas Eve, right? It may be, no, I'm not going to do that because that event is too harmful. And seeing it as a choice can help us find that courage, which is that next point, to be able to draw that boundary. And that's the key thing to me for boundaries. Boundaries are drawn courageously and they're drawn kindly, right? Without those two things, they together, it's not a boundary anymore, right? Kindness sometimes means I may have to kind of repeatedly say it, and it might get angrier when I say it, and that's okay. But the courageousness and kindness together, where it's what Brene Brown talks about is the stiff spine and the open heart, right? That we're doing both of those things at the same time. We hold to our boundaries, but we're offering them kindly and saying, this thing, I cannot do this thing, right? I'm going to do this is what I can do. This is what I can't do, and holding to that. And understanding that there's no negotiation required here, right? Our boundaries are not up for negotiation. We're going to communicate them as often as possible. But those things are like, it may be that I'm letting people know, like, hey, this year I'm going to be staying at a hotel down the street. I'm going to come in for dinner and for this event, and then I'm out, right? Like those types of things, and being able to say that clearly, and then holding to that, and knowing that our boundaries are probably going to be challenged, right? Very few times do especially when we draw them for the first time, when they're new boundaries that are being drawn, being able to draw them can be, they're going to be challenged. And so we have to allow for that and plan our response for them, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes repetition is our friend. Sometimes it's sometimes that when boundaries are challenged, it's like, I've communicated this and I'm not going to talk about this anymore. Yeah. I'm not going to do this anymore. But they are hard, and they are really difficult. Mm-hmm. This one I'm going to talk about real briefly, but it's because I want to get to a couple others. But we've talked about it a lot as this ideal holiday, and thinking through where did that come from, right? And how can I take it out, the holidays, whatever the holidays are for me, out of whatever box that it's been put in, whether that's culture, whether that's family history, whether that's movies and television shows and media, whether that's whatever that is, or that's my own wants and everything in my head. How do we take that apart? And I'll just give you a quick personal example that was something that was really powerful for me. Is I was like, being alone on the holidays is always taboo, right? When you're alone on the holidays, I had family members that kind of react really strongly to that. Or, why are you going to do this? And a few years ago, I was facing just a lot of stress around the holidays. It felt obligatory. It felt all this stuff. And one of the things that my therapist actually helped me work through this as well, just saying, why do you have to do any of that? Right. And like, she was like, what would you do? And the more I thought about it, right, it was like, I would take a trip by myself. I want to be by myself. Like, that's how, like, I want to go someplace I enjoy, right? I had the privilege of being able to do that. Not everybody does, but I went somewhere by myself, right? Someplace I wanted to go, someplace I liked to go, did all the things that I wanted to do. And it honestly, like, the minute I got off the plane, right, it was magical, right? It felt like there was this level of freedom that comes with that, of saying the holidays do not have to look like we think that they look, right? It is made up. And so we have to figure out what we want, but we also have to just take it out of its box there.
If I can add, I love that example so much, Adam. And if I can add another one, I had a queer client who has an accepting family, but has a family that deals with some alcoholism. And I remember before Christmas last year, she was talking about how she always feels obligated to spend so much time with her family over the holidays. And I asked her, I was like, well, what do you want to do? Like, picture your perfect Christmas day. And she was like, I do want to see my family, but I only want to have lunch with them. And it's after lunch that's when the booze comes out. And I was like, okay, great. So, like, let's go to lunch, but then what do you want to do after that? And she was like, I just want to go home. I want to sit on my couch and I want to watch Christmas movies all day by myself. And I was like, do it. Great. Yes. Awesome. And I came back after the holidays to see her, and she was like, it was the best Christmas ever. And another example, but I love that tool there, Adam. That's really good.
I think it's just really helpful to do that. And it's scary at first, right? To do something different. Like, there's this element at first. I was like, am I going to be too lonely? Is it going to be depressing to do this thing that I've never done? Yeah. But I think when you see that, like anything else, you can survive it and it can be enjoyable. There's a lot of empowerment in that as well, I think.
For sure.
This one I want to make sure we kind of talk about too, because there's a way that we then take control of actively creating safety. And I just want to give you a couple things. It's like, when any space, but particularly family spaces, don't feel emotionally or mentally safe, right? And we feel, we're going to be around them, right? There's going to be triggers, we know. Right. We talked about, if it's physically unsafe, you obviously do not want to be there. If it's emotionally unsafe, you have to evaluate your own ability to exist in that space. So just a couple of things. Some things that are helpful is just creating a mantra of self-acceptance, right? Something that is repeatable, is easy to remember, that you can say to yourself over and over and over again. And this has got a bad rap. There's been some, like, I think maybe SNL sketches that give mantras as a bad rap, right? But this idea that we're countering those negative thoughts that are in our head, particularly in those messages of shame and judgment that may come from spaces that are not safe. And so being able to have something that counters that reminds ourselves that we are okay. I'm worthy of love and acceptance, right? Or things that are like that. I'm worthy of protecting my space and setting boundaries. Like saying those things over and over and over again to ourselves helps to counter a lot of those negative thoughts that we have, and those things that kind of pull us and help and shrink, right? I love that one about shrinking. Like one that I was thinking about when we're doing that is mantra of I'm allowed to take up space in the world, right? I'm allowed to take up space, right? I don't have to shrink for other people. The other thing that helps create some safety is making sure to make plans for breaks and time away. So things like making sure you're exercising and moving while you're there, right? Things where I'm going to go get coffee with a friend, right? One of the ones I use is I'm going to be the designated person that runs to the grocery store when something inevitably has been forgotten, right? And planning breaks to say I can be here for this. My mantra is going to work here. I can exist for a specific amount of time, but then I need a break and I need to pull back. And have some time away, and having those pre-built in, I think, can be really helpful. And similar to this, but determining a safe place to go when it's needed, right? If the space that you're going to be in for the holidays doesn't feel fully safe, then talking to maybe if there's a friend nearby, a trusted friend nearby, where you can pop into their space for a little bit, right? Maybe there's a local coffee shop that feels safe for you, right? Where you know that you can go when it's unsafe. But a lot of these things, the breaks and having a safe space, in a lot of ways are about not having to think about what we do when we get triggered or when there's unsafe things happening, right? We want that to be just in our head as well, right?
That's really good. I'll move to the next one. And this is actually something that you spoke about earlier, Adam, when you were talking about your client and wanting to specifically name that rejection that he was feeling, that he was just like, oh, I'm hurt. And you sort of helped sit with him in that pain and that hurt and be like, but what's hurt? And he was like, it's the rejection that feels hurt. And so there's a real importance need to define what specifically has happened. What is the pain? What is the harm? Because so often people can say, gosh, my family's just the worst. They're bigots and, they're awful and whatever. But we need to talk about, why is that personal to you? What does that do to you? This is perhaps something that is more risky. And so I would say only do this if you know that it is safe. And that is to communicate that harm, if it's safe enough to do so, with your family. I sometimes with clients will help them sort of reenact in my office what it is that they want to say to their loved one, right? I'll say, okay, your mom is not in the room with us right now. It's just you and I. What is it that you want her to understand? Can you tell her right now? Can you stay close to that pain? And can you speak from that pain and help her understand what that pain is saying? Yeah. And also, what is it that you kind of need to hear from her as well? If you could, like waving your magic wand, what is it that you would need to hear from that other person? And sometimes it is truly just not safe enough for them to have that conversation. And so I'll encourage them, maybe just write a letter. Maybe you need to, I love voice memos. Maybe you need to save a voice memo on your phone of what it is that you want to say to your loved one. Maybe also it's just writing on your notes app on your phone what it is if you were texting your family member. There's lots of different ways that you can communicate that harm, even if it actually doesn't even reach the person that needs to hear it. And if perhaps your family does respond to that need for repair and they apologize, do not say, oh, it's fine, don't worry about it, and brush it off. I can imagine, I do this all the time when someone is, apologizing to me, but really accept their forgiveness. Allow them to know that pain pain occurred, harm happened, and it's not fine, because the moment we give them permission to understand it really didn't bother me that much, we essentially enable them to do the harm all over again. Engaging in social support and finding that social support, this is pretty straightforward, but who are the allies in your family unit, or even that are geographically close by, that you can reach out to? How can you also remain engaged with your social support system back, in your home where you live and spend most of your days with? Who are your friends, who your partner? How can you create this pattern where y'all are checking in with one another on a daily basis? Maybe it's, hey, can we start a group chat with our friends, and every morning and every evening we just check in with one another? How would that sound? And seeing how you can lean on one another even from a distance away. And then also, especially if you get the sense that you are going to be in danger, letting your support system know where you are, sharing your location, and letting them be aware of where you could run into issues. Sorry, I'm having to go through these last ones really quick because I'm seeing our time, but last one is create that entrance and exit plan. I love to make an entrance, but sometimes it's best to know how to make that entrance. Yeah. So honestly, sit down, create a plan. When should you arrive and when should you leave? When are most of your allies, if you have any allies, when are they going to be at your family home or at the destination, so that you are walking into a place of safety, if there is an element of safety. Also, that was a typo on my part. It is assess how to arrive and exit. So how are you getting to the destination as well? Putting limitations on visits, just, boundaries as well. And then also mapping out those possible risky events or situations that may happen over the course of the visit. Are you going to be left alone with your parents, who perhaps are really having a hard time with accepting you for a few hours? If so, that is really a time that you need to schedule some self-care and some boundaries for yourself. Went through that real fast just for the sake of time, and I'll kick it back to you, Adam, for this.
Yeah, well, I think I'm going to just sort of questions. There's this quote about shame that you'll get access to the replay, and you can kind of read some of that from there as well. We're going to offer your first session free. That'll be in an email follow-up as well, but I want to take some time to just make sure that we are answering any questions that are coming up as well. And so
you have a question. Did you see that one?
I did. I'm pulling that up right now. So it's from a parent perspective. What is the line between shrinking oneself and making small allowances to gain greater acceptance, to slowly introduce acceptance to the entire group rather than shock and awe? What is acceptable as a parent to ask that is working toward engagement rather than harm? I think that's a good question, right? Like there's the idea that if there's a big change in my life, especially when it's closer to that coming out time for somebody, for a queer individual, for the rest of the family, I think the idea is that for me would be that's doing that in conversation, right? What feels okay, what doesn't feel okay, and in part trusting where there's harm for your, if you're a parent, trusting your queer child for what is harmful and what isn't harmful, right? And then figuring out what's that going to be. Maybe it's like we're not going to try to change grandpa's mind, right? Especially not at the dinner table. But as a parent, like one of the things that you can do is really communicate your own backing of and support for your child in those situations as well. Jonathan, what would you add to that?
I like that, because I love that you said, like, how do you do that in conversation too? Because I think perhaps parents sometimes may feel the pressure to say, okay, I have to bear the burden of making sure that everyone is accepting, and therefore I'm going to perhaps encourage maybe my child to act in a certain way. And the child may not know what is motivating you to act in that way. And they just see, oh, mom or dad is making me not bring my partner around, or maybe dress in a certain way. I feel hurt. I don't know where they're coming from in this. And so in engaging in that conversation, you allow them to see your motivation and where you're struggling, and where perhaps you can get some insight from the child as what is it they need as well, right?
Yeah, and I think there's a perception too, like the shock, and I really kind of look at like what do we mean when we're talking about shock and awe, right? Like we're not. I think for most people, most queer folks, like when you're looking at what's happening when you come into a family gathering, right? We're not looking for necessarily like everything to be about the person's queerness, right? We're not like looking like everything to be rotating around that person, right? But it is about like, okay, how does our family, right, continue to treat us in the same way that they did before they knew that information about us, right? So that we can be fully authentic and they can know us better, right? And so how can that happen, right? And if you're coming into a family where that's just really hard, pulling that out and teasing that into what that really looks like can be difficult, but in conversation, that would be good as well.
We got another question. I know we're right at time, but I'm just going to read this as well. Stephen says, thanks, Adam and Jonathan. Really like your thinking around designing your ideal holiday. Might have missed this, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on navigating a heightened expectation to attend religious events and spaces that may or may not be safe. That's a really good question. We did get to briefly speak on that. Just I think you gave an example, Adam, of maybe there is a church service that your family is sort of you were speaking about obligations and choices, right? Where family will say, okay, well, you're sort of obligated to attend this church service. Where is it that we can reframe that as choice as well, to say, no, I get the choice to attend a church service if I want to. Yeah. And it's also hard at times to navigate, okay, how actually safe is this church as well, right? And for the queer person, they get to decide how safe that church feels, if at all, to attend, or a religious event.
I think there's a couple things I'd say real quickly here too, is that a lot of that to me is like repeating to yourself, I do not have to be in any space where I am unwelcome. Mm-hmm. Right? Like I don't have to put myself in spaces where I'm not. It's not okay for me to be. Where there's going to be some threat to me, even if it's like there's going to be a belief system that is pushed forward that I don't agree with, right? Or that is not mine that I have. And it comes back, I think, to giving ourselves permission to draw boundaries around those things as well, of saying, I get to draw boundaries around this, right? If there's going to be a lot of pushback, a lot of blowback from that, then I have to make a determination of, I'm going to hold, this is the boundary that I'm going to hold. And if you haven't, and this kind of leads, it's a little bit different, but I would just say this too, if you are new to drawing boundaries, what I would encourage you to do, right, or feel like your family doesn't respect your boundaries or you can't draw them clearly, is pick one, right? A lot of times by picking one, right, maybe the religious event is too much right now for you to draw a boundary around. That's okay, right? I would encourage you, I still don't think you have to be there, but maybe that's too much. But maybe you're not going to go for an extended period of time, right? Maybe you don't go whatever day that religious event is, right? And you show up the day after or the day before or whatever it is. But the idea of find a boundary that is yours, that you feel empowered, that you can draw, and start there. Because a lot of times doing that first step then empowers you to be able to do something that may be harder, like saying, I'm not going to the church service this year.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Well, thank you guys so much for hanging with us. I hope it was helpful. Speaking of, we're going to do another one here pretty soon on religious trauma, LGBTQIA+ individuals and spiritual and religious trauma. And so hope you will join us for that one, where we'll kind of dig into that a little bit more. But thank you so much. You're going to get an email with a couple of things with our PDF. And in fact, I'm going to just drop it in the chat right here, the link to it as well, so that you can kind of have that. But it'll also come to you in an email. And it'll also come with you for a way to schedule an appointment if you need it. A lot of these things, we need help to be able to work through how to draw boundaries, how to strategize around these types of things. And so we want to be helpful to you. And so if you're a new client, your first session with us will cover the cost of that for you to be able to do that. So please reach out for that as well. But that'll all come in an email, but the roadmap PDF is right there for you as well. So thanks so much, everybody.
Thank y'all.